Thank you very much, Saïda. Rebonjour, tout le monde. I'm not going to say very much here at all because both of the people that are going to come up on the stage in a moment have already been introduced. But I do want to say a couple more words. Jim Balsillie will be talking about IP and economic growth, a sovereign value-added path forward. And I think you got some hints about the kind of things he's going to say and the questions he just asked. I do want to say one or two additional words about Jim Balsillie. And he has been introduced as, an entrepreneur that you know from his time as co-CEO of RIM BlackBerry. But I want to emphasize how much of a role he has played in the strategic thinking and the policy thinking of Canada on IP and on many other areas. And so he's a deep thinker about these things. He's going to share some slides with us to talk about some of the ways that he frames the strategic issues. And then we're going to move into a Q&A with Konstantinos, the CEO of CIPO, is coming back up. And then if there's time, we're going to open it up to the floor. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Jim Balsillie and Konstantinos. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Paul. Good morning, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you to CIGI and CIPO for inviting me to speak. This event comes the day after our budget, which makes an ideal moment to reflect on how we think about innovation, investment, and the ownership of ideas in Canada. Before I sit down with Konstantinos for a fireside chat, I will briefly talk about Canada's economic realities and the innovation ecosystem needs, and what the innovation ecosystem needs to be critical drivers of national prosperity, security, and sovereignty, and how CIPO can play a bigger part of that. The digital transformation over the past 40 years has created a new economy in which wealth, power, and security are rooted in the ownership of IP and control of data and AI. These assets behave differently in the market than tangible goods and require different strategies. They now make up over 90% of the S&P 500's $49 trillion total value. With the rise of AI, we've entered into the era of machine knowledge capital, a new form of productive capital that competes with and complements human capital. Because Canada missed the shift, we're now seeing Canada's standard of living in steady decline. Our GDP per capita shrank by 0.4% annually over the past 5 years, the worst among the 50 developed countries globally. The OECD projects Canada will be the slowest growing advanced economy through 2060. The growing gap in GDP per capita between Canada and US further shows that these are not global conditions, but a consequence of a lack of strategic reorientation as the world changed. At the household level, the cost of living gets getting higher. As paychecks have gone down, costs keep going up. In today's economy, productivity comes from new ideas that bring in new high margin revenue. IP has a direct impact on wealth and power at the firm level and nationally, which is why smart innovation jurisdictions focus on owning and protecting these ideas. Canada's IP payments and receipts deficit is growing and would be far larger if we accounted for the net flow of AI and data. AI is transforming industries at scale in ways we haven't seen since the rise of the internet. Over 1.8 million AI patents have been granted globally, but Canada does not appear among the top 100 holders, even though our publicly funded research built the foundations of the field. This gap speaks to a lack of sovereign value-add approaches to how we connect invention to ownership and control. Nations that own their compute, their data, and their IP determine their own economic and security outcomes. Those that do not will find themselves renting their future from others. On this slide, I list a few examples of jurisdictions that reoriented to own and protect valuable IP and data assets to ensure their economic and security spillovers. In Europe, the creation of the European Patent Office and the new unitary patent system reduced costs and fragmentation. In Germany, the Fraunhofer Institute bridged public research and industry converting taxpayer-funded R&D into industrial capacity and global market strength. In South Korea, the Intellectual Property Office was recently elevated to a full ministry as IP ownership increased as a national priority. In China, industrial strategies such as Made in China 2025 and the New Generation AI Development Plan combine fast patent portfolios with control of data assets to secure long-term control in key technologies. In the last few months, the US has exercised strategic behavior in several policy areas to reshape the rules of the game. The AI Action Plan, which defines AI as a pillar of national power, the Genius Act for digital currencies, IEPA tariffs to restructure the terms of trade and regulatory remote control globally, and the assertion of March-in IP rights under the Bayh-Dole Act. These are not isolated, disparate initiatives, but rather part of a coherent policy framework to enhance US economic and security dominance globally. Because ownership of IP and control of data is essential to economic performance, CIPO plays an important role in supporting the firms that drive innovation and growth. On this slide, I outline 5 straightforward reforms that could strengthen this contribution. 1, introduce an enhanced Canadian provisional patent that secures a stronger domestic policy date and encourages domestic firms to file in Canada first. 2, ensure PCT search reports from CIPO are high quality and well regarded internationally. 3, reform small entity rules to permit defensive licensing and pooling without penalty. 4, clarify guidance on patentable subject matter to support stronger domestic protection. And 5, consider joining the European Unitary Patent System to reduce costs and improve enforcement for Canadian firms. Together, these firms would enhance CIPO's role as a key partner in helping Canadian firms capture and retain more value in global markets, building the foundation for long-term wealth and security. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you.
There should be a microphone there. All right. Thank you, Jim, very much for being here and for always supporting us in trying to understand how IP continues to evolve and how critical it is for our country and what it means for innovation. We do have about 50 minutes, so I do encourage people in the audience to kind of think of some questions to bring forward, but I would like to start with a couple. So the theme of this conference this year is IP catalyzing innovation. So what do you see as the key linkages between IP, innovation, and productivity? And how can we use that to help us get over the long run issues we've had around lagging productivity and innovation and ensuring that Canada can reap the benefits of IP and innovation? More generally, and then perhaps we could look at some specific examples of what can be done. But more generally, looking at the theme today, what do you see as the key areas we can focus on?
Sure. Well, I mean, there's 2 parts there, and I'm going to break them apart on kind of why we're here. I mean, there's an outdated pridefulness in the economic orthodoxy of Canada, very much anchored in Toronto and Ottawa, where they use 1970s production economy with comparative advantage, and it's a cost-based efficiency model. And then you have a rules-based order where everybody agrees to the rules, and it's about efficiency for border adjustment. And therefore, when you do that really well, you compete on costs. And if you're not doing really well, then you do some market failure incentives or quick write-offs, and then you get more. And if you're still not doing well, you depreciate your currency, and away you go. That's the Ricardian comparative advantage production model. And then they can model these things through forms of economic equilibrium theories. When you go to a world based on intangibles, which is why I keep putting up that Ocean Tomo slide, which is going up, up. I mean, you have to keep updating because there's another 10 trillion into it every few months, is that you make money by extracting a rent on negative rights. And that's a completely different system. So trade agreements were designed conceptually in Canada to spread competition, where now contemporary agreements are used to spread monopolies. And in fact, your capacity to extract a rent is not a production efficiency function, but rather a rentier inefficiency function where you create increasing returns to scale. And you'd be shocked how stuck people are in the old form of thinking. It's and for me, I can be quite gentle about these things, and I can have backroom conversations with lots of the most senior people in Ottawa. And for 10, 15 years, they were having none of it. And I'm going, the way you talk about this economy bears no relationship to what I'm experiencing in the world. I'm not coming at this with an agenda. I'm just telling you, this is hugely dominating my life. It's incredibly strategic in Washington. It's geopolitical. I have great mentors there. How we navigated the State Department. I was on the U.S. Business Council of the public-private frameworks. I became very familiar with the varying systems around the world. And I'm saying this is completely absent in your domestic thinking. And they say, well, we just put that in the category of management. And I go, no, this is more than that. This is the government creates the markets, changes them hundreds of times a day through judicial decisions, standards interpretation, and so on and so forth. Patent enforcement, IP offices and all their machinations, re-examining, ... And they just have none of it. And so we really took ourselves substantially out of the rentier economy and do it. And if you read the budget, other than a couple little nods to IP, which they're saying, gosh, we got to look at this, you see that it's all an incentives-based production thing, that if you just get the incentives, 10% a little here, it unlocks the whole thing, not understanding it's a landlord and tenant system of 1-0, which is me. And the other thing is that if it's a landlord and tenant system, it's not modelable. It's not an efficiency thing. It's a game theory thing. So you have to assess it through a lens of strategic behavior and game theory, not through economic efficiency and equilibrium. But candidly, all the folks doing the analysis and all that, they're in outdated models. And we were having a bit of a chat on this, that the strategic ability to refine our rare earth minerals, how is that in any of the models that they're using in economic development if you're going to rule by econometrics? And so I just got to the point where I'm not putting up with anymore. I'm not suffering this folly of inattention. And now they're kind of giving little bones to it, but it needs to be completely rethought. And Canada does $7.5 billion a year of research funding. Absolutely no strategic thinking of how that links to our norms. It's just an article of faith. Give the money and it turns into outcomes. But in fact, we all know in this room that that system requires a whole set of connected, technical, coherent pieces. So bottom line of it is, until they get the fact that how it's at play, and of course this is all supersized with AI and the IP of AI, but also the compute function that monopolies of economies of scale, scope, information asymmetries, and so on, that the data has to be linked in this, which there was some before. It's just not going to work. Our economic structure is going to be much more attuned to Russia's rather than a sophisticated Western economy. So it requires a reorientation. And then once you kind of go, oh, this is really, really, really critical, and there's thickets and strategic behavior and landscapes and ... then it comes down the chain to say, so we got to get in the rent game, not the production game. Like, for instance, accelerated capital cost allowance for equipment. Well, is that really what we need if we, because then the person who you buy the equipment from gets the rents, and if you don't have the freedom to operate for the process and method, you still have to pay a tax on that. So maybe the accelerated CCA should be for Canadian manufactured machinery to actually turn on that aspect of the game and interrelate the adoption rights of what's going on there. But you read all this stuff, it's not there because they all grew up in an era where that was I mean, I have an economic specialist. I know the what they were taught, and I just hit the realities of that in the world, and they just have to update their thinking and put a strategic lens to all of this stuff.
Thanks for that. We can always count on Jim being provocative in how we
Not
look at
provocative. I'm honest and knowledgeable.
this is true.
If a kid is running into the road in front of a truck and I scream, stop, I'm not being provocative. I'm trying to stop the kid from getting hit by a truck.
Well noted. Look, I've got a ton of questions, and I appreciate the broader view and pulling together all of the different threads that underpin an effective economy. Let's play this out because what I would love to come out of this conference is a couple of examples of how we can dig down and make it tangible. We heard a couple of threads.
Make the intangible tangible.
We'll put that on the bumper sticker. Earlier on, we heard about a couple of threads, for example, around critical minerals. Let's play this out. So basically, as you've identified the landscape, the challenges we've had and potential opportunities, or running in front of a bus, how does this play out in a particular area? So maybe we could dig a bit deeper in critical minerals and
the punster, right? Piece of idea.
Yeah, I'm curious how you would see it play out tangibly, because we need to be able to make it real and bring it down to sectoral points of view so we can inform policy.
Yeah, and I didn't come into this with that agenda today, but all the stars seem to be aligning a little bit. So it just kind of emerged. They put 450 million into processing critical minerals. Burju's going to be talking about the landscape type stuff. In her next panel, Catherine was talking about reimagining how we get into this thing. It's become an immense form of geostrategic stuff. Canada has some resources that it wants to create more economic activity, and they don't understand that where they are and where they want to get to is going to have to run through what everybody hears about. They literally are blind to this. And so I think once they see that they're hitting a wall and that you've navigated around that or over that wall, then I think the penny will drop. Because, I mean, the joke that they have about me is I love ideas, so I live in abstraction a lot. But not all the world lives in abstract, and I think through abstraction, and then I make it tangible. And so I think a lot of the world lives in very specified characterization of what's happening. So I think if you take this abstraction that we all live, and look at all my recommendations, they're very tangible, but they're abstract. But if you actually say, and by the way, if you do this in critical minerals, your econometrics goes to the moon of outcomes economically and strategically. So we need updated econometric models. They're woefully outdated in the 70s. And so you have a world that's changed. I showed you that Shintomo chart to start, and the models don't reflect that. So I think, yeah, if you go into something really geostrategic, obviously very relevant to all of our allies, makes America feel like poking us in the eye isn't always a good idea, creates a lot of good terms of trade and value-added jobs, can pull a lot of SMEs through it who can do aspects of that, use lots of AI, use lots of smart supply, because intangibles don't have big supply chains, but when you mix the tangible with the intangible, you tend to pull very interesting supply chains through more. Yeah, so I think that's the pony right now. I'm sure there's, and then if you wrap it into dual use defense, that's a double pony. So I think we can really cook something here that says it makes the penny drop. Is that provocative or is that knowledgeable? And
that is extremely helpful.
okay.
And in fact, on your last slide here, thank you for thinking through what this could mean for an IP office. And we have many IP offices represented here from around the world today. I mean, these represent some ideas that we can push forward. Clearly, it would need to be linked to priority areas, critical technologies, and areas of Canadian strength. So thank you for that. I would like to unbundle a few of those, but perhaps before we go there, and again, I do ask the audience to think of some questions for Jim Balsillie. It reminds me, we were at a conference and I heard you speak about a year ago in Toronto at the IP Summit, and you were speaking about the highly competitive nature world we're in. You spoke about the need for freedom to operate. You spoke about IP leakage out of Canada.
There goes Jim crying wolf again, right, on strategic behavior.
Well, honestly, at the time, I thought, great rhetorical tools that we're using to talk about, the importance here. And honestly, I thought, well, maybe Jim's laying it on a little thick, but well, sir, let me eat crow here because the world has changed in the last few months. And now in this hyper-competitive environment where our trade flows are being restructured, where potentially manufacturing will follow, based on where you were a year ago, how do you see this playing out presently? And what do you foresee? Because your thoughts back then were prophetic, clearly, and I'll put you in the hot seat now to see how it's going to roll out.
Who's the? Yeah, Cassandra, right? Great, I get to be Cassandra. I think I wrote a piece earlier this year that it's called "We're All Economic Nationalists Now." That this strategic behavior has been going on for a long time in everything. It's not a new phenomenon. The issue is the changing structure of the world makes it even more rewarding for strategic behavior and penalizing for absence of strategic behavior. And we were having a bit of a chat on about China and its capability. And I've talked about this for quite a while, that the US really pushed TRIPS back a while ago to globalize IP, and Europe said, well, we got a lot of IP. We'll play along with that. That's pretty good. Kind of keeps the developers rich and the less developed in a tighter box. And then the US tried to jackhammer a lot of data stuff through the e-commerce, which was really about just recognizing digital signatures and all that, but they wanted to sneak it in through this factor of production into these realms. And and in Europe was going, whoa, we're not as good here. And so we're going to push back. And then all of a sudden China was saying, well, gosh, this is an interesting game. We can play this better than anybody else if we become a smart state. And then so they started accelerating. And then the US said, whoa, I'm out. And I'm out. And so, yeah, we've got to, this is an era of very strategic behavior. And I've said this before, I'll say it here. We're in a world where there's no economic allies anymore. There's security allies. But if somebody has to be the landlord and somebody has to be the tenant, then there's no alliance structure in that. You're just buying into the game enough so that you can nudge disproportionately more than your fair share of being the landlord and the tenant, but it's a big game of win-loss. And so for Canada, it's very obvious. Just get more front-footed and get more strategically updated and strategically capable for the world as it is, not a sentimental and naive worldview. But be very, very cognizant of security alliances, because we do have deep, genuine security alliances. And so the conception is very. I don't think Europe has a naive conception. Uh, I've seen their moves, and they're cognizant of the way the world is. I haven't seen it in Southeast Asia. I haven't seen it in the U.S. So I think if we join the European unitary patent system, well, that's an interesting thing because Europe does federation pretty well. That makes them bigger. That gives them a major spot in North America. That makes Canada super strategically relevant because we're part of a true market that matters. So you can kind of say US, EU, and China. So again, but these are esoteric until there's an updated understanding of how the world works in the productivity function. And Ottawa is very dominated by capital allocators who say, I can do an ROI and I will allocate to the best ROI, and I don't care what jurisdiction it is, but I think they have to say this is not a capital allocation issue. This is a how do you make your jurisdiction exciting to draw capital, which is an ecosystem dynamism issue, not a fixing market issue through and just marginal incentives. So this is why the game is a different game, and there has to be an updated nature of the discussion game, and that's why this conference is so important in what's going on.
So looking back, I mean, we have had some faults. There have been some gaps. We've fallen behind. With the world being restructured as it is presently, and also announced in our budget yesterday, significant spendings in defense, also nods toward natural resources, strategic minerals, becoming an energy superpower. So now, if you will, we may be resetting some of what we tried to do in the past, all at the same time. So in terms of planning that going forward, how do we prepare for that kind of investment? I mean, meeting NATO targets for defense spending will have significant R&D investments. What do we need to do to prepare for that, to help ensure that the innovation comes here, stays here, that we could reap the benefits?
Yeah, I mean, yesterday's budget was just basically a status quo budget with bigger deficits. And so and I think was to be the most important budget of my lifetime. And I think it just there's I don't know what the constraints are. I don't know what the politics are. I'm not a politician. I think when you understand something, you have much more confidence. So if there's not understanding, you do muted measures. They did do a bit of a nod. They kept a few very small programs going on IP, but they're spending $1 jillion. Will this just be another case that we spend and 95% of the economic spillovers leave the country? I think we need a proper reorientation to the way the world is. They had a sovereign compute program, and the first $240 million went to a U.S. firm for sovereign compute. It's kind of like using your health promotion budget to subsidize cigarette machines in the school cafeteria. I get that you orient to health promotion, but gosh, this takes you away, not towards. And so when 60% of the CIF projects are foreign firms, but it's supposed to be strategic innovation, we can't afford this. We have to do better with the money we have, and we have to understand that the inattention has created an asymmetry. So we need some collective actions to rebalance that asymmetry. And by the way, I chaired a panel on IP for the province of Ontario, so we studied all the different jurisdictions in the world. They've all had collective strategies to rebalance asymmetries. It's not a novel approach, but we have to embrace it. And at this time, we're going to more defense and more NATO and need more economic prosperity and need more productivity. Is it through the production function of faster capital cost allowance of foreign bought machinery, or is it translating to a rentier economy where you get more rents for value add, leverage where you have advantages, which we have lots of, and those were shown. So
That's the reorientation we need. That's what you guys are about. There's many, many baby steps in this budget, but I think it has to be much bigger, much faster, much more strategic reorientation. And I hope the sort of feedback evaluation, which was part of the budget, that they're going to say, well, gosh, maybe we will just look at this a little more carefully. And I guess I'll take it because I'm an entrepreneur. I'm an optimist. So I want the optimism. But if I was, and I was involved very deeply in saying this has to be done really substantially, really deeply, and that was at the highest levels, and it wasn't ambiguous and it wasn't expensive. It's a strategic orientation, not about spending more money. But I didn't see it there. But I'm hoping the baby steps say we'll get it in some implementation really, really soon. And I sort of shrug my shoulders and say, I hope so.
So thanks for that point of view. If I could ask you to put on your entrepreneur hat and kind of business owner BlackBerry experience hat. So we talked about the global world, how that's changing. We talked about national priorities. We talked a little bit about sectors. What advice would you give to the company, the individual entrepreneur? How do they navigate this? Because it will take time for these investments to go
Yeah.
through in the economy. What do they do now? What kind of advice would you give to a colleague trying
Sure.
to?
And I'm 2/3 of my time is with my businesses, super active in the US, super active here, very large stuff. We've transacted a couple of them for a couple $1 billion from ideas, and doing in the Middle East. So I am a businessman at core, and I love it, and work with entrepreneurs all the time. The most important thing I say to those is learn capitalism. That's the part we teach. And I gave a keynote on this a week and a bit ago to the skills thing in the Globe. And if you want it, my chief staff Alyssa can give the remarks and the slides. And I've been involved in funding and starting 4 programs to actually teach capitalism. And one of them's with Paul in the Digital Hub, and one's with CPAs and a couple others I can go at not today. But capitalism is a strategic navigation of managing enclosure systems, and IP is a critical part of it. And there's many forms of it. We focus on patents, but there's dozen different forms. You can integrate it in your contracts. You can integrate it in standards, essential patents. You can you can, and then how you navigate data. So I think if we teach that, and then you couple it with the stuff we do teach, then I think it's dynamite. I've also been a long advocate, which now is getting purchase, that the global structure really, really affects this stuff. And there was kind of a benign sense that that was a given rules-based, static, quasi-static system. But in fact, we've seen just a seesaw game of geostrategic stuff at play, and how you get and so how you navigate that. So, and that's a critical aspect of capitalism. So I would just say learn these realms of intangibles and how they get played, and then interrelate, and learn them in practice of your industries. They're all a little bit different, and they've all got different spins on it. We've spent a little particular time on rare earth minerals and value adding them here. We could particularize that in any sector. There was some good research from the gentleman from the conference board on that stuff. So I think you have to play out capitalism and know how this manifests at the firm level to grab your rent. And I had a guy over for dinner earlier this year who runs a big global IP organization we all know, and it's been around since the 1880s. And he talked about this stuff, and we were talking about the system. I said, yeah, and they need to understand that hundreds of these demand letters are sent out every day. And he says, no, Jim, you're wrong. It's thousands. So this system is being managed at this substructure that then everybody has to live with in ways that you don't know. And so how are you preparing to send a demand letter, respond to a demand letter, incorporate this in all of your NDAs and your licenses, and anyone who's practiced knows this is the game all day, every day. Like, this is what you do. And but somehow it's not taught in our schools and programs. It's not taught in our public policy domestically. It certainly is south of the border. I imagine it's taught in other jurisdictions, but it's but boy, oh boy, getting them to pry open their minds to incorporate this in the public policy and in the university curriculums. It's it's uh, it's just heretical.
This is real world experience talking here. We do have 20 minutes left. If you're open to a few questions from the audience, please raise your hand. There are microphones that will be brought to you. So we have Alexis up front here with the first hand up.
You briefly mentioned other nations and what they're doing with education around IP. And I have friends and family in Germany where at age 14, 15, they are already learning how to game with IP. How do we make that happen in Canada? I recently approached a couple of different groups that teach high school students, offering to help them with IP curriculum, and I was blatantly told to go away. How do we start to change the culture there so that we can compete globally on that level?
Yeah, well, I mean, to quote the immortal Maya Angelou, when you know better, do better. And they don't know better. And so, and once you know that this matters and it's for all the marbles, and that these systems determine our fate in so many ways, then, but a big part of, I chaired this panel for Manitoba that Wab Canoe and I released, and good success on Friday. And there's a lot on IP, there's a lot on skills, and this idea that everybody's in their little silo of skills, but the jobs for technical people have dropped 80% in Canada in the last couple of years. And I know they're difficult in the US. So all these people that got these great job experiences in engineering, computer science, can't get a job. And so I think we have to start to say there has to be an interrelationship, secondary, post-secondary, lifelong learning, the academy, the businesses, and all that has to revisit and actually accord to what is and adapt in a world that's changing crazy fast, or how low do you want it to go? So I think it's noble that you were doing what you're doing, and I think it's ignoble to just dismiss it out of hand, and that's teach them capitalism, if only if they want to be a creator to get the benefits of it, or how this is affecting human rights. These are not just economic, they're not just security, they're enormous human rights issues for your identity, for knowledge access, for the democratic realm, for human agency, on and on it goes. So if you don't understand the mediation structures for everything we value, then I'm sorry, but you're selling short our normative foundations, and that's a moral failing. So yeah, I think that's why I'm 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 very direct on these things, because they're not going to hear it unless it comes at them. But guys like Wab Canoe are part of the answer. Open-minded people want to rethink these things. Everybody's worried about the future jobs. If they don't listen to you, then they're going to have a harder time prospering. And everybody wants to thrive in the world as they come on through. You never meet somebody who doesn't. But I think that's selling short people. And so a little bit of my talk was on the skill stuff a week and a half ago. Is sometimes when you have a problem, the answer is to make it bigger. And this isn't really just a skills issue. This is a future of work issue. This whole thing is upended. And I could go into great detail, which I won't today, but we have to be going at these chunky issues, and we can't dodge them by just status quo finagling around the edges. It's too big. It's too much going on. It's too disruptive. And so yeah, I encourage you to keep going, but I think we have to come at this a bit more collective, a bit more strategic. I can do a bit more air cover with my direct knowledge, full honesty, call it provocative if you want, but I don't think I'm provocative. I'm saying there's a train barreling down the tracks and the car stopped on the tracks. That's like, and we didn't, we built a house of sticks, not a house of bricks, and we made ourselves easy play to strategic behavior. But I'm on the U.S. Business Council. I know how they think. It's all about leverage. And this idea that we're all in some global group hug of a Barney episode is not not at all what I see.
Thanks for that. Clearly, foundational knowledge, in particular with new technologies coming our way, make it even more important to reach down from K to 12 and help people try to anticipate and prepare for the future. Do we have another question? Yes, over here.
Hello, bonjour. Rutha Astrovas from Department of National Defense. I would like to hear from you your thoughts on the defense industrial strategy, and also how can we get the small and medium firms, the innovation ecosystems, to better play with us. I'm thinking there's low take up still on some of the government programs, not seeing the IP protections and that strategic thinking across the board. How do we help entrepreneurs get smarter to play better in this world with the investments and meeting the moment?
Thank you. Well, again, I found our entrepreneurs really courageous, world class. They do great globally, but they have tremendous pushback domestically. It's a self-sabotaging structure from domestic policy. So, for evidence, 60% of the CIF money goes to foreign firms. It's absurd. And all of the research stuff was basically leaking the country and not connecting to firms to create the positive spillover. So the public policy doesn't have a proper analytical framework for what they're going to do, and thus you disenfranchise the SMEs. And so they're adaptive to the environment. They're not, if you go against the signaling and the incentive structure, you'll be bankrupt. So I think it's POGO. I've seen the enemy is us. We have to pay much more attention to how do we, and I've been drawn a little bit into the new defense agency that are they going to do an IP collective of some form for that, or just let it all leak out? I'm involved with standards for defining what's a Canadian company, because a lot of non-Canadian companies are being very good at pretending they're Canadian companies, and ambiguity is not our friend ever, as the old expression, bank error is never in our favor. So we have to decide we want to be our own best friend. And we've not been it economically, strategically, security, and socially. And we have paid a sorry price in this country because of that failure. So I think it has to start at the top. They have to give clear direction, strategic like D&D, CIPO, ISED, all of these things, the intramural research, which is $3.3 billion a year, absolutely no coherent strategy to own those things, independent of the defense stuff, independent of the 4.2 granting council. It really is a public policy failure. And then, of course, nothing to do on the data, nothing to do on the AI of the data. And what happens is when you don't attend to the big red bar of intangibles, your GDP per capita goes down. And that's why we're last place. And they furrow their brow and think it's an incentive thing if we give an accelerated cost allowance, or we give some flow through shares or a grant. It's all Ken Arrow economics from the 1950s. Nothing attuned to the contemporary enclosure realities. It's anachronistic. And so that's where we have to go. And I would put that, the dual use stuff is a huge opportunity. Critical minerals as a subset of dual use is a huge opportunity. Moving on down the value chain, not only to extraction, refining, but actually follow on deeper products, is an enormous opportunity. The Chinese did it with a subset of the mines. Imagine what you could do as a developed country with the mines, especially when the rest of the Western world is a bit spooked on this game. So yeah, it's time to actually attune to what is going on. But I did see the budget as a status quo budget. And that means to me, I can tell when people are bureaucratically nervous, that they don't have confidence. It's like, you ever been on the dance floor and you don't know how to dance, so you just wiggle and look at other people and see if they move their arm in a way you want to copy, but you're not confident on the floor because you don't have a view of yourself and you don't have a view of what it is. And I think that is how I see it. And so we have to somehow help them see what's going on in the sea of opportunities here if we reorient. But I didn't see it yet. But maybe the next 6 to 9 months will be part of that awakening. And this is just a mini peekaboo.
I've got a ton of questions, but I know there are microphones floating around here. Elias? So thank you, Jim. I've obviously had the pleasure of sharing stages in different ways with you over the last number of years. Between the puns and the analogies, I just will steer clear.
He's the pun guy.
And you're the analogy guy, so I'll just steer clear.
He's the pun guy.
But I'm going to be maybe provocative towards you a little bit on this and going even deeper into sort of really, we talked about like concrete examples and stuff like that. And where I'm going to end on this, just to give you a little precursor, is what is the private sector's role in this as well? But what I want to talk about is how do we actually slow down IP leakage and retention, which I see as the buildings in this landlord-tenant relationship. If you don't have the IP, and patents is a clear one. Some of the issues I hear about when we talk about it internally is, we don't have the absorptive capacity in certain industries to actually onboard some of these ideas and call them small nascent firms because we don't have the bigger part of the portfolio. Zafir talked about the size of patent portfolios in Canada. They're just not large enough, right? And so we don't always have a landing spot for these firms. Couple with that, the idea that publicly funded research has generally got that collaborative side of it, and often the US is going to come up north of the border and say 66 cents of my dollar gets $1 Canadian, and I can walk away with that IP. Really sound strategy from their part. Our fear sometimes here in Canada is that if we put a restriction on the outflow of that IP, the capital won't come in the first instance. So things you can think about are how do we structure programs to restrict the flow of IP, or do we have to backfill that capital? So what I'm really curious about is what is your thought on specific policies like that? And then what is the role in the private sector? Do we feel like there should be some elbows up Canadian perspective where they're willing to say, you know what, I'm going to back some of these ideas, even though we don't have the industrial capacity presently to fully realize the benefits and help bridge. I'll use an analogy, build the big bridge that's needed so that train doesn't go down the chasm. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, Canada is world class on false myths, and this idea of absorptive capacity is baloney because there's nothing to absorb. It's either not filed or it's already taken through the partnerships because there's no organizing structure. I mean, I won't talk about Max Planck because I'm not as close to it, but I know Fraunhofer quite well. Everything defaults to there, and then it's very strategically deployed thereafter, where we sort of give it away and there's no attention to it, and then these things manifest in their interest 4 or 5 years down the road, and there's nothing to absorb. So they say, well, there's no absorption capacity, and my response is, absorb what? And if you're going to have the naive public policy that just throws it all away, and it's non-strategic, and you're not going to manage asymmetries through collective things, and you're not going to teach it and how it goes, and you're going to give false conceptions. You look at USMCA. I mean, raise your hand if you read USMCA, the Million Words Party with me, but you won't find the words free trade in it. And there were essentially no tariffs taken down it. So what are those million words about? It's infusing structures of regulatory remote control to disable your firms, to disable your public policy, to disable your potential. And then we have our politicians irresponsibly running around saying, Canada has more market access in the world because we went on this pub crawl of free trade agreements, not understanding that these are instruments of regulatory remote control. So Canada doesn't have the most market access. Canada has the most shackled restrictions. We're the most restricted SMEs in the world. Why aren't you so successful? We put all these balls and chains around your ankles. And why can't you run faster? So it's a false set of conception right at the very, very beginning in this. And so I've seen the enemy is us, and it becomes more public-private framework. The more your firms get bigger, and we became seen as an American company in the US State Department, and they would help us on these battles where Canada's hands off. And so my joke about, you've heard the joke about the US, it talks Jeffersonian but rules Hamiltonian. My joke about Canada is we talk Hamiltonian but rule Jeffersonian, and we need some Hamiltonian in this because that's the strategic behavior of the world. And but it's a whole package. It's very hard. You ask some good questions. They're very hard to break apart. They're all one thing because the intangibles economy has nonlinear consequences for small pieces of inattention. You can leak the whole. Where in the tangible economy, if you get it 90% right, you get 9% of the benefit. In the intangible, if you get it 90% right, you get 10% of the benefit. It operates differently. So you have to come out as a package, and that's why I talk about the U.S. coherent framework. China, we could go on and on. They had a very deliberate set of structures. Time for us to get in the game. I hope I answered your question, Elias, a little bit.
Right. Thank you. Do we have any other questions?
Someone back there at the back. She's at the back.
Okay. So Natalie Raful here. I'm an IP lawyer based in Ottawa. Thanks so much, Jim. We're actually so grateful for you being provocative because
No, I'm
telling the
knowledgeable
truth.
and honest. I'm not provocative.
Exactly.
I'll tell you this.
Thank God for Jim, honestly.
In Ottawa, provocative is code words for dismiss them.
Yeah.
Just to let you know, it's code words by the bully structure of the incumbents. I'm not saying you are.
I didn't know that.
But it's bully words from the senior folks to dismiss somebody that, oh, he's here to entertain us, not inform us. Anyway,
yeah, but I sat on that expert panel with Jim that culminated in our report in Ontario in 2020 on the commercialization landscape here in Ontario. I guess, Jim, it would be great. We talked a little bit about how to support SMEs. I mean, the biggest program we have here in Canada is SHRED. And maybe you could just, spend a little bit of time talking about SHRED and the way we fund any of these kinds of partnerships with private industry here in Canada, because we're funding research, but then we relabel that as innovation. And that is really, I think, the big problem. So when we talk about how we're supporting our own industry, we're not really doing that in the way that we want them to, which is to orient towards innovation, not just get funded for research that sits on a shelf and not looking at the innovation piece, which is actually adding to our GDP.
Yeah, thanks, Natalie. And Natalie's been a great actor in helping reorient this kind of stuff domestically. So thank you for your leadership. It's weird on SHREDs because it used to be at Industry Canada where they write checks, and then they moved it to Revenue Canada where they collect checks, and you wonder why it's hard to get payments through. So they did a few things in SHREDs in the budget, but the one elephant in the room is that when you're a domestic firm, the spillovers kind of stay here, the tax base, the wealth effects, the headquarter jobs, the economic dynamism, but they give SHREDs also to foreign firms, and they won't tell how much, but it's a huge portion. My guess is probably 60 to 65% of the SHRED money goes to foreign firms, but they won't let us know because they keep it hidden at finance. And therefore, when you raise all these levels, it still raises it for foreign firms. So you're right back to the SIF issue, which is 60% of SIF money goes to foreign firms, even though the spillover structures are not domestic. And then you don't manage the research stuff so that it comes into economic dynamism. You get ambiguous definitions of Canadian company for defense, like the procurement, like defense, and then you don't teach it in the systems, and then you kind of go, why aren't we doing very well? And it's a package, whereas other countries are doing really great because they look at it as a package. And so I think SHRED is nice, but is it really nice? Is it optimized, or is it just a little bit less worse? And I think it's a little more the latter, that it has to be but if you had an updated analytical lens, analytical framework, you would change. But they view a branch plant production economy framework where this is like a hyperscaler data center is the same as a pulp and paper mill in Northern Ontario from the 60s. And in fact, they have very different or a research partnership with a hyperscaler. They operate differently. and the spillovers are completely opposite, but they haven't got an updated analytical framework. And I think that's where we got to go. I know Paul's thinking of the analytics and we're going to apply it in a vertical, and maybe the penny will drop when you actually look at the econometrics. But it's not there here.
Experience in working with government is I'm still struggling with that definition of what is a Canadian company. We
course.
really need to hone in on
course.
CCPC, Canadian controlled private corporation, like Microsoft Canada, Huawei Canada, Nokia Canada. Those are not Canadian companies. All the IP is offshore. And so we really need to improve our programs in terms of how we're assisting our own companies. And just on the reorientation, we were talking about research funds. I mean, my experience is because a lot of our research organizations have multi-year programs where they're working with foreign companies, it's very hard actually for our Canadian companies to get in there with our research institutions. So when we talk about, you know, where is the absorption within our economy, we have it, but it's impossible to get in when you have multi-year, you know, research programs happening with foreign multinationals. So we do need to start to move and reorient. Like even it would be novel to do 10%. I think less than 5% of research across Canada by dollar numbers actually goes to Canadian companies. The rest of it is partnerships with foreign multinationals. So if you started to say, you know, let's do 15% with Canadian companies or 20%, that would be huge.
Yeah, and by the way, Australia had provisions in their law to unwind foreign partnerships in this realm. We've advocated for that domestically, but crickets. And again, and so what is going on at that political level that doesn't attune to the things that you very accurately bring forward, Natalie?
I think we're on a bit of a roll here. I know we're a little pressed for time, but let's keep going. There's some really great thoughts here, and I do want to come back with one question for you, Jim, at the end.
Okay. Thank you so much, Konstantinos and Jim. Great questions, great discussion, and I get a sense that there are still a lot of missing links in our engine. Last week, I spoke with over 50 university tech transfer managers, and what they tell me is that when they try to do a deal, licensing deal with a Canadian company, nothing happens. And a US company approaches them with multiples. They're underfunded, they're overworked. How do we address that layer, the tech transfer offices across universities?
Thanks, Horatio. Great question. And we dealt with that a bit in our panel, that the original sin of Canada when it did its free trade stuff is the innovation. They said, well, we're not going to have these crown corporations anymore. What do we do? And then they go, oh, well, innovation will be universities. So they gave the inventors the job for innovation, which was a big mistake. And they go, well, how are you going to diffuse that thing? And say, well, we'll do tech transfer offices, but they'll be non-core, subscale, not expert. And so Ontario has in the 30s of TTOs, but it's a small fraction of the size of the Fraunhofer Institute, which has one TTO. And so you hit the point, nail on the head, that what if we all want clean water, so we each build our own water treatment plant in our backyard? And of course, that's ridiculous. We addressed it through collective action to manage the expertise and the scale of that. But we don't do it in this function. We keep it an auxiliary thing. They tend not to be experts. They tend not to have the budgets. They tend not to have the scale. And this requires a broader thinking, because you kiss a lot of frogs in IP, and then 5% become valuable 6-7 years down the road, but you don't do that. And so we've advocated for getting more collective action, both at the provincial, at the federal, and then if those can cooperate, which we're seeing between the IPON and the IAC and the BC type stuff. These are freedom to operate's non-rivalrous, so it can be something that if Manitoba gives you this and Ontario gives you that, I'll let you have some of mine if you take some of yours, because it doesn't cost anything. You just got to manage free riders. But you have to have an institutional approach that says this is big enough and strong enough and central enough to make it happen, and not just hope that it's dealt with down the line by these things. And so when you take that several billion out of Ottawa every year, they just say, I hope you deal with this okay, try your best. And a lot of it's governed by union agreements and the faculty and all that kind of stuff. It's an afterthought. And then, as Natalie says, the 5% of domestic players becomes the effect. And we cannot afford this low functioning because we see what it does to our economy, the jobs, the quality of jobs, the unemployment, the GDP per capita, the cost of living. They're all a consequence of not participating in the rentier economy. So I think people like you and Natalie and Elias and all them got to be part of a discussion that says, what do we do to fix this system, rather than just shrug our shoulders.
Thanks. Any more questions from the floor?
Catherine.
Yes. Catherine here.
It is up. Okay. I was trying to build a project on AI, and our ideas was that the productization or the developers of AI and the users of AI needed to really work together to, make it a success. And when I approached the Ministry of Innovation, Economics, and in Quebec, and Energy, I realized that they were in two different parts of the same ministry and they didn't talk to each other. So do we have a public service that is too siloed to prevent us from doing this strategic thinking at the nation level or at the ecosystem level in order to loop all these elements? Because I said you have a department that deals with this industry and then this other industry and this other industry, but we need to connect across. So how do we do that? And yet our sectoral associations are industry-based as well. How do we break these silos?
Yeah, very, very insightful comment. Canada was organized the silos when it operated in those functions: forestry, defense, industry, and so on. Now you have it that defense protected the border, public safety stopped people from breaking into your house. It was all nice, right? And then commerce did business, and foreign affairs did border adjustments. Now what happens is these things don't respect the traditional borders. Certainly defense can happen without ever, there's not a ship shooting missiles across our border. It's happening in some other way, and it's public safety and defense at the same time, and it's industry at the same time. And then you get these new factors like AI and cyber that are much more cross-cutting, and IP, which is much more cross-cutting, and we use phrases like dual use very appropriately. So you're absolutely right. One, you have to be invested in expertise rather than dogmatic orthodoxy. That's the biggie. And so a lot of my belief is education. I started with the Maya Angelou quote. Second of all, you absolutely need to reimagine cross-cutting integrative approaches to these things. Like education, we talked about business and primary and post-secondary cannot be in their silos before. And so I think it's a capacity issue. I think it's reformatted decision structures that integrate cross-cutting. I think our legacy ministries had a play when the world mapped to them that way, but it doesn't map to it anymore. It's tricky because it's more matrixy than it was before. So yeah, I think this is a super fair comment. And I've been on the advisory board for the Canada School of Public Service for a decade. I think they've done a great job with great leadership, tried to be a part of this. But I think that goes to that expertise and awareness. But even if you're not going to sort of absorb IP as a critical thing, how in the world are you going to absorb energy and AI, let alone the IP to do that, let alone the industrial aspect of it? You bet. And so I think this goes to why conferences like this and the awareness and capacity building are so important. We're having those very relevant conversations. And I can only say your point's bang on. We have to reformulate things. Yeah, 100%.
All right, thanks. Look, this hour has just gone by too quickly. Let me ask a wide open question before we turn back to the Master of Ceremonies. We've covered a lot of ground today. What have we not touched on that we should be thinking about?
I think we have to, you cannot separate IP and data governance and AI and data governance and compute and the human rights and the protection, but it's factor production and the IP for AI. So I think you just can't separate them anymore. I used to try to deal with them as two things that hang out together, but it's a Venn diagram where the overlapping isn't 100%, but it's so much that you have to kind of talk about them a lot at the same time. But then again, you have to break these things into discrete parts to have constructive conversations. So that'd be the one. It's not a criticism, but it has to be on the table all the time.
Sounds like we've got a theme for our next conference. Please join me in thanking Jim Balsillie for being with us today and for covering such a vast amount of subjects that are critical for us. Thank you, Jim.